Hey guys, Leisure Games. Chris, let's do this. So, first half of 2021 is pretty much in the books. There have been a lot of crowdfunding games. I've covered, on average, almost 20 per week for the first half of this year. So, looking at 26 weeks, that's a lot of games, right? So, what were the ones that I would consider the biggest eyeball grabbers, the biggest, most interesting campaigns so far? Now, again, this list is not going to surprise a lot of you people. So if you're tuning in to, click the comment section below and see the spoilers, there's not going to be a lot of surprises on this list. This is not that list. But this is the why they are the most influential, the most eye-catching. I don't want to say the most important because that has a different connotation. But the ones of the most note for whatever reason in the first half of 2021. So, does my list line up with yours? Now, again, this is a relatively self-contained list because I feel like there are probably a couple on this list that you could have added in. There are a couple on this list that you could have taken out, and you wouldn't have been right or wrong in that sense. But these are the ones that stood out the most to me. If this interests you, thanks for watching. Click sub because there's more coming. By clicking subscribe, you'll get notified when I do the next video in this series, the 10 games that are going to be on my biggest watch list, the biggest know what you need to know, what we already know in the second half of 2021. So what are those going to look like? How are those going to be influenced? The timing of those, are they all going to be grouped together so you have to, kind of parcel things out, or are they going to be spread out enough depending on what you like and what you don't like? So that's going to be upcoming. Also, if that doesn't get you subscribing enough, I'm also going to put out a top list of my indie games. Because as you may have checked down in the comment section below, these are the eyeball catching, money grabbing, big pledge, lot of plastic type of games, and for the most part. But if you want to know my top picks for under the radar, unhyped, very successful, find that however you want, indie picks for the first half of 2021, things that you should consider even potentially looking at again at this point even, that's going to be coming up as well. So, now that preamble is out of the way, let's do this. Now again, no specific order. This is not from best to most best. This is just me letting you know the top 10. So, let's begin. Now, I'm going to start off with this one for more than one reason. Robinson Crusoe, the Collector's Edition. Now, the big point I'm going to illustrate here is not necessarily Robinson Crusoe, the campaign, the game itself. But I'm going to put it out there in terms of, and this is probably a whole separate video as well, of what GameFound is now capable of. Because now they have shown us that a non-Awakened Realms property can succeed. Now, granted, before this, there was Kingdom Rush, but that raised less money than the original Kingdom Rush did. And with that Kingdom Rush, there were also still smatterings of complaints, here or there, that it wasn't easy to find. And this was the one that really showed that, okay, GameFound is really going to have some traction. It's really going to have, the litmus test, it is passed. So that was the first big thing. Not only for Portal Games, but for Robinson Crusoe, but for GameFound. But the last point I'll illustrate here, sort of twofold. One, deluxifications. They're here to stay, especially on the heavy Euro mechanistically styled games. They're there. You're going to see a lot more of it. This is just cementing that. And the second thing this is cementing is you are seeing reprints of games that are not that old already. We are going the Hollywood modus operandi, if you will. That is what we are seeing now. And how much more of it will we see? That is the big trend of the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021. What else is going to get that touch? You can say what you want about what you should have gotten or what you shouldn't get in this game. There was a lot of good stuff. There was a lot of stuff in general. And the debate, I think, also is, does this style of game need plastic? Are you willing to pay for it? Because you often see the dichotomy as well between the Euro and the non-Euro, or the Euro and the Ameritrash, where Ameritrash games, those guys are just, they just throw plastic at a bunch of stuff and they're just paying for plastic. Well, how much of this was plastic, right? 115 euros of plastic. Well, a lot of other stuff too, but there was a lot of plastic thrown in with this. And you'd be not telling the truth if that didn't account for a good portion of the money. Now, I'm not going to say it obviously accounted for all of it, but that was a good number of people who wanted to deluxify, amplify, exemplify that on the table. And so that just has to be of note. So are we going to see that more across the board with this sort of thing? I don't know. But yes, I think the answer is yes. Because it brings in the cash. So that's Robinson Crusoe. Speaking of heavier games, the second one on this list, we're going to go, again, outside of my depth of knowledge, my breadth of most comprehension, and we're going to go with a heavier Euro game, and that's Darwin's Journey. And I'm mentioning that because of the rarity that it really is, especially in crowdfunding nowadays. It raised well over €1 million. Now, again, to contrast it to Robinson Crusoe, where we see it happen all the time over $1 million, €1 million with the heavy plastic side of things. We do not see it nearly as heavily on the Euro worker placement side of things. We just don't. And that is not because they had some huge ratcheted up price point. The main price point here was €70. So this is not a campaign that is driven by $300 or $200 pledge levels, where then the number of backers is considerably less. The number of backers here was almost 17,000. That's a lot, especially for a game this heavy. And I mean, you're getting a ton of money, and that is also the other thing that you need to be aware of. And I think this one was also the other reason I'm mentioning it. It sort of set the benchmark for deluxeifications in the heavy Euro market of 2021. Because it was the first funded, and I think everything else, for better or for worse, at least in my mind, as even a non-Euro person, is being compared to this. In price point, but also content, and just complexity. And I can speak a little bit on the first two, but the last one's outside of my depth, like I said. But I mean, 46 stretch goals, only €70, enough to go with it, especially those metal coins that I love. That's impressive. And again, this was not one that had a ton of hype. You don't see the Euro side of things having as much hype as the Ameritrash-ish style of games gets. I mean, the balance and hype is clearly weighing heavier on one side than the other. Much, 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 much more. No doubt about it. But this broke the mold. And now, obviously, it has a little bit higher expectation to live up to, but so be it. How much do you believe some of the hype videos? How much do you believe some of the previews? How much do you believe some of the videos on here in general? Is it going to be right for you? I mean, that is the other thing that is a whole nother video itself as well, right? How much do you like seeing those videos? How much do you get out of those videos? But either way, it's definitely of note, and it should be of note, because it set the standard for worker placements in 2021 so far. A standard that might not be replicated nor broken even in the next 6 months. But we'll see. Now, since I'm on a roll with the worker placement, let's just stick with it, and then we'll get to my bread and butter after this. Everdell. Everdell, Everdell, Everdell. Some, and more some. Now I'm not just going to talk about it because it raised gadzooks in terms of cash, right? The other thing that this did, similar to Robinson Crusoe, is it put a very interesting question to the board game scene, hobby, market, collectors, players, etc. It said, okay, if you are a late adopter, do you deserve, is it okay if you're paying less than the early adopters, right? Because what you saw when this went live and people looked at the price point for the all-in for $199, which was considerably less than some of the early adopters that had gotten the collector's edition from each Kickstarter along the way, they said, well, I'm going to sell my partial collection, try to recoup most of that money because you can get it now, and people sometimes want the now as opposed to delayed gratification, and then use that money to basically pay slightly more to get a brand new set collection in a little while. And that is a very interesting premise and concept. It is. Again, it's sort of like Robinson Crusoe. It's not the reprint of a game that didn't need it, but it's a, should the early people as well be applauded? Should they be given privilege over the late adopters? Because you can make the argument that the late adopters here are, clearly getting a better deal. But does that really bother you? That somebody else may have gotten a better deal, but much later? Again, it's a very interesting topic. For me personally, I go, no, I don't really care. Hey, that's great for you. Now, if there were significant differences, because that is also the other trend on Kickstarter, is the 2.0 version that comes out 6 months, a year after you get your copy, that would be more of the issue. I don't think that's the case with this, but that would maybe be the exception. But do you like that? Are you okay with that? Why wouldn't you be okay with that? But that is why Everdell got a lot of attention too. And because, frankly speaking, people really like it. It is a very easy to understand, easy to get to the table, not too much complexity while still having some depth, especially with the expansions style of worker placement. And it is hitting a chord with people about what they like, and this was more of that. So take that for what you will. Now this pledge level again was a little higher with the $200 pledge level for a lot of those, with almost 10,000 of the people doing that. So, a third of the backers doing that. Not insignificant, but still, it's of note. And we got to talk about it. And are you going to see some of that in the future as well? I thought, why not get all of these ones that have gotten attraction and eyes on them for various reasons other than the fact that people thought they were a super, super, super good game and were super hyped on it. We'll just throw those all at the beginning. So this is Stellaris Infinite Legacy. And if you were a subscriber to my channel when it was launching, I talked about that as well. I was an initial backer, and then, the first 24 hours hit, and that was sort of the interesting thing. And Academy Games took a lot of flack during this Kickstarter campaign. Rightfully and wrongfully so, I will say. Rightfully because for an IP that was as well known, and for amount of money that they raised, it was a little bit strange and a little bit off-putting that they didn't have more presentation to go with at the beginning, and the lack of transparency about some of the rules and the gameplay. That being said, I think that people have a tendency to hyperbolize a little bit of this as well. Is it the absolute horror and disgust that the often Kickstarter comment section will throw out there? No, it's not. But it's an example of, well, are you willing to risk that or not? And it's another example of, wow, this is a huge video game IP that again is translating to the tabletop scene. And so how much of that, how much of this $2.5 million of these 13,000+ backers are nostalgia going after the video game rush in a tabletop setting? And is it going to meet or max expectations in that way? That is the real big determiner. That is also a big thing. And this is, again, a whole nother video that I'm going to put out. Video game adaptions in the tabletop market. Should we be excited? Should we be worried? Should we just be both all wrapped up into one? And the answer is yes. But this is taking and trying to take a legacy style game to import it to allow adaptability, flexibility, ins and outs of player counts, ins and outs of savings, ins and outs of variable abilities and strengths in terms of knowledge base and abilities at just the game in general. And if nothing else, that has to be applauded. But as all games in this manner are, they will be finally judged on whether or not it can accomplish it, not whether or not it just sought out to push the boundaries and push the limits of this type, this style, this genre of the 4X, or the 4E, I think is what they used here, actually. But that is what's ultimately going to determine it. And again, how you feel on that, to your own. But that's why it's on the list. We might as well just segue into the other IPs on this list. And obviously, if we're going to talk about massive translation of IPs, you have to be talking about Monster Hunter World. Now, again, for better or for worse, with 20,000 backers plus and almost £3.5 million, this is, I would arguably say, Steamforged Games' most well-run, most accomplished Kickstarter campaign, crowdfunding campaign. And I give them a lot of kudos because they have evolved the style, they have evolved the approach, they have evolved the amount of information with each successive campaign that they have done over the last 1.5 to 2 years. And I think this shows, because I think if they would have held their cards as close to the vest as they have in previous Kickstarter campaigns, I don't think you would have had this much. Now, again, the question is, how much of this is the IP chasing fans that are maybe as familiar, not as familiar, or just very attached to whatever IP it may be, flavor of the month happening to be Monster Hunter now? Some, I'm sure. But I think also, just from judging the comment section here, the comment section elsewhere, Board Game Geek, people actually liked what they saw, and for good reason. I mean, it seems like a very solid game. And I could not have said that about a lot of the other previous campaigns based on, now again, I'm not judging the game, but based on what they actually showed during the campaign, because they basically said, here you go. Here's gameplay. Here's, everything that you want to see in terms of the rule book right here. Here's the different monsters. Here's how you play all these different elements. We're going to give you blogs that break down each one of these, the characters, the monsters, the mechanics. And I mean, I covered it. I put out a couple videos on it. And so again, I applaud them because people need to start doing more, and they will start to do more in terms of voting with their wallets if this stuff had not been done, because of the other issues in general on crowdfunding with games of this ilk, but also of their previous games. Now, again, like I just said with Stellaris, the concept doesn't matter if the execution is lacking. And so that is going to be one of the biggest microscope questions of 2022. Well, more likely maybe even 2023 when people get this to the full extent. Now, again, as you can see here, many of the big channels covered this as well. So there's starting to be more transparency that way across all of the big name games, period. And say what you want about whatever channel you want. More coverage, more exposure, more knowledge for us as consumers is a positive thing. Now, again, the ability to filter out which one of those or what is actually important to you on rule books, previews, reviews, whatever it may be, gameplay, is where you have to make your own discretion. But, there it is. Now, again, the other thing that they did, which is going to segue me right into the next game, which is the head-to-head competitor with this that came out early in the year, which is inevitably going to draw comparisons not only while they were both being crowdfunded, but also while they're going to be both in the process of being fulfilled, while they're both, production wise done and getting to backers, and probably for the next couple years even. And that's Primal. But the one thing that they both had in common was that they said, you know what, here's our all-in pledge. Right at the beginning. Obviously Monster Hunter a little bit sooner, I think, than Primal. But they said, here you go. You know, here's the all-in. Do with it what you want. We're going to throw stuff out between now and then, and if it suits you, great. If it doesn't, you know, this is what the all-in is. We're not going to drag it out, and we're not going to, you know, surprise you at the end and give you this €5 discount because, you know, you knew it was coming, but you just weren't sure what the price point was. And for both of these campaigns, that was the big eye-opener, but also the thing that I hope other campaigns do in the future, right? I like having the all-in up front. Say what you will about it. I wish that Awakened Realms would do that. I wish CMON would do that. You know, I know it's this marketing tactic, but I mean, again, let's scroll back up at the top here. £3.5 million says that it didn't probably hurt it much by announcing it beforehand. And again, I mean, this is a certain aesthetic that is just good. And there is a very large plastic aesthetic to this. And this is a larger price point, like I mentioned at the beginning, than some of those other campaigns. And so just take it for what it is. I think the mechanics are going to be very unique with this. Again, and I think this is going to be a very solid game. The question is, with a lot of these nowadays, is even some of these bigger name projects, you're not getting bad games. But is it the right type of solid for you? And that's the main question. And that's also the problem with some videos out there, is Kickstarter campaigns have videos saying that they are all good. But how do you decide if it's right for you? Again, a whole nother video topic. So, I mean, we just talked about it. Why not go right to it next? Again, all in, gameplay, right away, nearly exactly the same price. And it makes you wonder, and this is going to be true, I think, of campaigns in the future. And I would love to hear somebody's insider perspective, because I have no knowledge of this. But if you're Steamforged and you see these guys over at Reggie Games do their price point and see how much they raise, and, you know, again, less, you know, just over 2 million euros with 11,000 people. But do you look over your shoulder and look at some of these other campaigns and other price points of other companies? I don't really know. Does CMON do it? Does Awakened Realms do it? Do some of these big guys do it? Or is it some of the middling ones that are doing it with the bigger ones? I don't know, but I'd be curious to find out. Primal sort of had this unique niche at the beginning of the year, because a lot of the complaints I heard about it was that, well, this isn't Monster Hunter. The problem with that was it wasn't trying to be Monster Hunter. People were slapping that label on it and saying, well, this is going to be like Monster Hunter the board game, if actually it was Monster Hunter. Well, it wasn't trying to be that. It wasn't trying to stay true to it. And so when people were slapping that label on it and then getting upset because it wasn't exactly what Monster Hunter was, that made no sense to me. It is its own unique entity in and to and of itself. And that's great. And this is, you know, one of the reasons it's one of my most hyped games of the year, back when I did the end of 2020 looking at 2021. And it's probably going to stay in the top 5 unless a couple other surprises come and knock it out of its position between now and the end of the year of my favorite Kickstarters in general, personally speaking, for 2021. Now, was it expensive? Oh, heck yeah. Did I need to spend that much money? No. Did I have serious regrets about it? Yeah, I think a lot of us did. But then Monster Hunter came out, and I think you saw a lot more certainty on people's sides, right? I think you saw a lot of people go one way or the other. They said, oh, wow, Monster Hunter. This is not what I was expecting. This is not what I like. I'm really glad I went with Primal. Or vice versa. They said, wow, I'm really glad I waited for Monster Hunter because I like this a lot better. And I'm really glad they did it this way because I didn't really like what Primal was offering in terms of the mechanics, in terms of the movement, in terms of the circular grid style versus the terrain and the map elements. And you know what? That's great. Because the one thing I will say on both of these, that both of these going head to head and competing over the same market, competition is good, folks. Because if you see lack of competition in other areas, other hobbies, other businesses, it sometimes breeds, I don't want to say laziness, but it breeds contentment. Meaning you are content in terms of your place. And so maybe you don't try as hard. And I think knowing that both of these were vying for a very similar crowd, a very similar market, may have ultimately, a little bit in a sense, been better for us as consumers. And we may get a better end product because they know that if they didn't, then our money would go elsewhere. And that's the type of voting with your wallet that you really have to do nowadays. And I love the fact that there's just so much here. Now, I wish there were more heroes, sort of like Monster Hunter, but I wish Monster Hunter had more creatures like Primal. So, again, to each their own, to each differences be their own. And I think people are going to be equally happy with each one of them for different reasons. But that's why it's on the list. Look, I would be amiss at this point without putting on a CMON game. Now, if you were expecting Zombicide, you don't know me. But I'm going to say Marvel United because, again, this was sort of one of the trends I mentioned earlier that I briefly touched on. Now, a 2.0 version, because when you compare this, Marvel United, the chibi superhero-themed dungeon crawling, X-Men entailing, not Avengers, but broadly encompassing the comic book scope of things, not just the general populist knowledge of the MCU. This game takes the original Marvel United to the next level. But in typical CMON fashion, there is a strong element of Kickstarter exclusiveness and the fear of missing out because there is so much exclusive. And there was a lot more than anyone, I think. Maybe some people had insider knowledge. I definitely didn't. There was a lot more in this campaign, especially at the end. It was like all of a sudden at the end they realized they had an expansion and after expansion that they to throw out. And so in the last like 4 or 5 days of the campaign, we saw the Sentinels, we saw Old Man Logan, we saw Silver Surfer and the Fantastic Four. We saw all of these come out of the woodwork. And all of a sudden that all-in price point that I mentioned earlier that they never revealed came out and was $295. And this is another example of things that I really don't like seeing. And I will talk about this, but it even happened with other campaigns that are somewhat of the darling at times too. Something like Arena the Contest, for that example, when that one first came out. Content locking content behind the higher pledge levels. You are only getting Old Man Logan at the all-in pledge level. You are only getting the stretch goal box from the first Kickstarter campaign if you get the all-in package from the first set of expansions from the first Kickstarter campaign. That drives me crazy a little bit at times. Because I honestly don't know what I'm going to do still. I mean, I have the $100 pledge. I think the $100 pledge is by far and away the best, most complete pledge level that you can ask for. You get a couple other expansions like Gold and Blue that allows the co-op and the competitive. And you get whatever 1 or 2 others is your ilk. I don't really want Deadpool, but it may end up having it for the all-in. But that's the sort of thing that you get. And like with all of these, whether it's Awakened Realms, whether it's CMON, whatever it may be in that ilk, the best pledge, the most valuable pledge for your money is by far and away the base pledge. Without any expansions that are add-ons. Whatever that may be. And in this case, I'm using the Apocalypse pledge with the Horsemen of the Apocalypse and the stretch goal box as your best pledge, because it is by far and away. And the next game campaign I'm going to talk about after this one, I will say the exact same thing. Because expansions are where the bang for the buck is just not there. And that's where a lot of the cost is recuperated in a lot of these situations. For better or for worse. I mean, it's no judgment. It just is what it is. And this one strikes again on the nostalgia factor as much. And it also just strikes on the fact that it's just better. Now, the question is, for someone like me, what am I going to do with my 1.0, right? I've been very tempted to sell some of the expansions. One, because I don't think some of the expansions are all created equal. And I guess that's a whole nother video, in case you haven't heard me say that already, is, do we need all the expansions? If the expansions aren't all equal, then why am I buying them all? And the problem is you can't tell which ones are going to be better necessarily right away. Now, in retrospect, maybe you can, using your retrospect vision anyway. But it wasn't clear to me. I also wasn't paying as close attention the first Kickstarter campaign around. But I agree when Eric Lang on Twitter months ago was like, hey, this is one of the designs I am most proud of in the last decade or whatever. He said something similar to that. I'm misquoting him, I'm sure. And Eric, I apologize. Not like you're ever going to watch this, but I apologize for that. But he said something along those lines. And it's because it's a very good system. It's very adaptable. I mean, that was the key component. When the first base game came out, people were like, this is too simple. It's too straightforward. But then you had people recognize that, oh, wow, you can do this with it without making it that much more overhead complex and with adding a lot of depth there. Oh, and then you can do this. Oh, and then you can do this. And that's what you're seeing with this campaign. It's like they took that engine and like the Unreal Engine in video games and they expanded on it. They expounded on it without having to necessarily change it that drastically and still get significantly more results than what you would expect with the minimal amounts of changing that were necessary. And that's why it's of note. That's why it raised almost $6 million. It's probably going to raise another $500,000 in the Pledge Manager alone, probably is my guess. For people like me that are, still deciding between all-in and $100 pledge. Or somewhere in between. So, that is Marvel United X-Men. The next one up with the best value at the lower pledge levels, minus all the expansions, that is The Witcher: The Old World. It is. I said this in my review synopsis should you back video. That thank you. You guys have done a great job in supporting me. That thing has probably the second or third most views on any video on my channel so far. That was a huge surprise for me, considering the timing of it from my side of things and just the visibility of it in general. So I really appreciate you guys clicking on that. Again, this was a game that I said, comparatively to some of the other games earlier, this is going to be a very, very, very solid game. This is not going to be a bad game. I played it. It's solid. If you like what it entails, you will enjoy it. Again, that is the blessing that I mentioned earlier of having all this more information. And again, I think you get people that are sometimes a little bit overly critical. But if you like the context of what was out there and you like the core of it, I don't think you're going to go wrong with this game. This is going to be a very good game. Now, the question was, with all of the expansions again, with all of the modifications mid-campaign, with all of the modifications that were supposedly made or changed or open to suggestions, I mean, again, that raises the flag of, are we taking too much from backers and not sticking as true to the design of what the design team wants in the first place? That is a legitimate concern of mine as well at times, because I think you can be too overly listening. But I think they were probably the most interactive and the most listening in terms of what people were asking for and asking about, in terms of especially anything high money in the last 2-3 years easily, right? Now, again, how much of that is pre-planned, how much of that is adaptable, I can't speculate on that. But they seemed very willing to have conversation two ways. And I give them a ton of credit for that. Again, the question just is going to be, what is the final product going to look like? And is it going to be worth that all-in price? Because that all-in price was not insignificant. And this was over 6.75 million euros. And the all-in pledge, 230 euros. Again, this one was one where a lot of money was raised just by the all-in, because this is a lot of plastic. Me personally, having played it, I don't think the plastic's necessary. And that's why I say, without a doubt, that this standard pledge right here, with the amount of expansions that you're getting thrown in here and the content you're getting thrown in the standard pledge with these other content expansions, I think by far and away it's the best deal. Now the question is, are you going to feel incomplete if you don't have some of this other stuff? The legendary monsters, the island expansion, the deluxeifications with the miniatures. How are you going to feel about that? The playmat, the metal dice. Anyway, but that's the sort of thing that, you have to ask yourself. But again, I think this is a solid game. It also falls under the IPs that I mentioned earlier. And this, I don't know comparatively, but in terms of translation from video to tabletop game, this has to be up there with one of the biggest ones ever. Not just in terms of money, but just recognition. I don't know how it compares to all those out there. You guys can debate that in the comment section, but it's up there, period. And again, tons of information, tons of adaptability, just very straightforward, lots of videos, lots of stretch goals that people were, for the most part, happy with. So, there you go. Again, notable for all of those reasons. So, that is The Witcher. Old World. Next up, we have obviously the other big plastic one, but in a whole different realm of the skirmish, dueling, strategic, but also highly tactical side of things. Mythic Battles Ragnarok. Monolith's follow-up, much hyped, to Mythic Battles Pantheon. Now again, the amount that it raised comparatively was a lot less, but the big difference with this one was the price point was a lot less too. If the price point had been a lot more, if they had thrown a lot more in this campaign, I think you would have seen a lot more. But it just wasn't nearly as much stuff, which honestly, that was my big question. Like, that's my big question with MU right now, Marvel United. How much more do I need? And especially as I mentioned in the other two already, the best pledge is this base pledge. It was the same thing true with Mythic Battles Pantheon. The secondary stretch goal content box that you get plus the base game is massive and more than enough that you ever can go through in a reasonable amount of time. And the same thing with this. So when people were saying, what should I get? Well, you get one of the base games with the stretch goals. Clearly. All the other stuff is superfluous. Again, speaking of pledge managers that I don't know what I'm going to do with, I don't know if I need most of these other expansions. I like the idea of several of them, but I don't really feel the necessity like I used to. And that's partly my maturing on the Kickstarter side of things, but partially just going, I have way too much stuff to begin with and I can only play so much of this. So some of these, like Ragnar, I know people like that one, but I look at ones like this, Loki's Kids, down here at the bottom, as ones I really want. But do I justify it? That's a whole lot of other money. Again, another whole, extra set, the equivalent amount of the extra I'm going to have to pay in Marvel United as well. And now with the shipping stuff that's going on, is that going to affect that? Yeah, you darn tootin' it is. It's affecting my price point and my judgment on these things. But again, it shows that plastic and good games with good pedigrees are going to raise a bunch of money. And this one, again, just like Marvel United, has a good pedigree. It's well thought of. It's a very straightforward, solid game. There's no question of if the engine is good with this one. It was just more before the campaign launched, whether or not it was going to be different enough. And from the mechanics they've shown, absolutely. Now, is it for you? That's a whole nother question. Because, again, I could probably make an argument that this isn't for me at all. And I probably shouldn't back this, and I should probably cancel my pledge because I very rarely get this type of game to the table. But I can't resist it either. So maybe I'll just keep the pledge at that. But for all of those reasons, that's why it's on the list. Last up here, My Father's Work. Now, again, I'm going to bookend with the worker placement style games. And again, I'm going to put this one out there because this one was one I didn't expect to do half as well as it did, and it raised almost $1 million with 10,000 backers from Renegade Studios. Because again, $100 pledge point. And the innovation there with this generational worker placement type theme and mechanic, again, is very intuitive, it's very original, and I think people are recognizing that and backing it accordingly. So that sort of ingenuity is getting rewarded nowadays. And it's good to see that because it shows us that you can be open and experimenting with new things, do them in a solid way, and people will respond positively that, again, voting with the wallet. Now, again, is this a $100 value for a worker placement style game? And can you justify that just as much as you justify, on the Ameritrash side of things with my Mythic Battles and my MUs and all that stuff? Well, that's on you. Again, 6 of one, half a dozen of another. But that's why it's of note. Expectations were low and it overachieved, I would make the argument, in a very good way. And that's why it's on the list. Now, I'm going to give you a bonus one here at the end. This is my honorable mention, and this is Stationfall. One that I wanted to back, one that I wanted to like, but the price point was the hold off. But I want to point it out because, again, just like My Father's Work there, the ingenuity and the creativity in this game And the difference between a lot of the other stuff that we see out there is notable, and it should be rewarded, and it should be complimented. And I think it just needs another emphasis behind that because of this heavier social deduction type game with a very unique mechanic of traveling around this station and being able to manipulate any character on the board apart from your own even, so that you can try and achieve your objective with the alien that's crawling around trying to blow things up, and you know you're limited in time because the station's going to blow up anyway. And it's just uniquely different. Again, I applaud this sort of stuff. I want this stuff to be rewarded. And, you know, getting almost $250,000 shows that people, again, are willing to do that. And so I like that. I want to highlight it and I want to mention it because, I mean, it just looks like a great game too. And so this one is going to be super high on my list of games to watch when it's delivered in 2022. Because I don't think it's probably going to make it by the end of 2021. But that's okay. If it does, great. But that's why Stationfall is my honorable mention on this list. So that's it. That is my top 10 plus one. Hope that's okay with you. And again, not just for money reasons, like I said, but for a variety of reasons that each of those projects illustrated, displayed, or brought up as points to consider or think about going forward, or that have been issues up until this point. So if you liked what you saw, let me know. I'm sure there were some that you will disagree on, or some that you thought should probably be in this list as well. Let me know in the comment section. And like I mentioned, the upcomings in this series, we're going to have tops of July. We're going to have top indie games of the first half, ones that would not have made this list, but are still very news and notable, as well as the top ones I'm looking at for the end of 2021 and what you need to know about them and when. So if that interests you, if that intrigues you, let me know. Again, throw in the comment section. What would you want me to see or put on the list of the end of the year ones? Now, because again, I've got my list started, but it's not completely firm, so I can definitely be persuaded. But let me know. Okay. Thanks for watching. Stay classy. See you around.